when I walk back to that dressing room, I'm ready to like beat him to death.
Brett's very nonchalant. He's getting undressed and he's explaining to Vince that, I'm going to take a shower. I'm going to get dressed. And if you're here, I'm going to knock you out.
I leave the room because I don't want to watch Vince get punched.
Finally, Brett gets up, walks across the room, and he launched a punch that I have no idea how it got through. Hit Vince right in the temple, and Vince went down.
It was Vince and me came at each other, and we actually tied up like a wrestling match. And I remember going, the only way I can get a shot in, one shot maybe, is an uppercut. And I came right up between Vince's arms.
Man, he hit me so hard, right in the temple.
He was out cold like a starfish.
Drilled him.
Vince McMahon hated him more than anyone. He never softened it, never hid it behind the spectacle he controlled, never disguised it beneath the confidence of the most powerful figure in professional wrestling. Under the bright lights of the WWF, he appeared unshakable. The commanding walk, the sharp voice, the absolute authority that made him look untouchable in the eyes of millions. To the public, Vince McMahon was the chairman, the architect, the man who built a wrestling empire that changed American entertainment forever. But that was only the version the world was meant to see. Behind the curtain, the environment he ruled was far more brutal. The WWF of the late 1980s and 1990s was a battlefield driven by ambition and politics. Promoters fought for territory. Networks demanded results. Wrestlers battled not only inside the ring, but for position, power, and survival. Every man in that locker room wanted the same spotlight, the same money, the same chance to sit at the top of the industry. Loyalty was fragile. Jealousy was constant. And Vince McMahon's authority was challenged more often than fans ever realized. In that world, grudges were born quickly and stayed for years. Vince McMahon carried some of them deeper than others. 5 men, in particular, left marks he never forgot. 5 rivals who pushed him, threatened him, betrayed him, or came close to taking away everything he had created. 5 hidden rivals. Who were the rivals that defined his rise? And which name will shock you the most? Before we move into the list, we need to remember who Vince McMahon truly was. Before Vince McMahon became the most powerful promoter in professional wrestling, he was simply a young man trying to earn the respect of a father who barely knew him. Vince McMahon was born in 1945 in Pinehurst, North Carolina. His childhood was far from the glamorous world that wrestling fans would later associate with his name. His father, Vincent J. McMahon, was already a respected promoter in the Northeastern wrestling territories, but Vince did not grow up inside that business. For most of his early life, he barely saw his father at all. Instead, he grew up moving from place to place with his mother, surrounded by instability and uncertainty. Wrestling, the industry that would one day define him, was something distant, something mysterious, something he only heard about in stories rather than experienced in person. That changed when Vince finally met his father as a teenager. For the first time, he saw the world behind the curtain. Smoky arenas packed with shouting fans. Wrestlers larger than life walking through narrow hallways behind the ring. Promoters negotiating deals in cramped offices while trying to keep entire territories alive. For many people, that chaotic environment would have been overwhelming. For Vince McMahon, it felt like destiny. In the late 1960s, he began working for his father's company, which was then known as the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. At first, he did the small jobs, announcing matches, promoting events, learning how the fragile ecosystem of wrestling actually worked. Every territory had its borders, every promoter had his influence, and breaking those unwritten rules could start a war. But Vince was not interested in maintaining the old system. By the early 1980s, he made the decision that changed the entire wrestling industry. He purchased the company from his father and began turning it into a national television product. The move shocked the traditional promoters who had spent decades protecting their territories. Vince ignored those boundaries completely. What followed was a revolution. Under his leadership, the company that would later become World Wrestling Entertainment exploded into mainstream culture. Events like WrestleMania turned wrestling into a national spectacle. Stars such as Hulk Hogan carried the company into arenas across the country. Television deals expanded, merchandise exploded, and the wrestling business, once fragmented into dozens of regional promotions, began orbiting around a single empire. But revolutions always create enemies. Every promoter Vince replaced, Every star he signed away, every territory he dismantled, left someone angry enough to remember. And as his power grew, so did the number of people who wanted to see that empire collapse. Over time, a handful of rivalries became so bitter that they defined entire eras of wrestling history. And the first name on that list belonged to a man Vince McMahon once trusted more than almost anyone. Number 5. Bret Hart. For a long time, Bret Hart was not an enemy at all. In fact, he was exactly the kind of wrestler Vince McMahon believed could carry the future of his company. Calm, disciplined, technically brilliant inside the ring, Bret represented something different from the loud spectacle that had defined the Hulk Hogan era. When the wrestling world began shifting in the early 1990s, Vince saw Bret Hart as the man who could lead the next chapter. Bret came from wrestling royalty. The Hart family in Calgary had built one of the most respected wrestling traditions in North America, and Bret carried that legacy into Vince McMahon's company with quiet pride. Inside the locker room, he was known as a perfectionist. Every match had to mean something. Every movement had to look real. Fans trusted him because he looked like a man who believed in every moment he performed. For several years, that trust worked both ways. Vince McMahon placed the championship on Bret Hart and presented him as the face of the company during a difficult transition period. The industry was changing, television audiences were shifting, and the cartoon hero era of the 1980s was fading. Bret Hart became the steady center of the storm. Reliable, professional, loyal. But the wrestling business rarely stays stable for long. By the middle of the 1990s, financial pressure and creative changes inside the company began pushing everything into uncertain territory. Rival promotions were aggressively signing talent. Contracts became complicated. Personal pride began colliding with business decisions that no one wanted to make. And then came the night that changed everything. In 1997, at the Survivor Series event in Montreal, Bret Hart stepped into the ring, believing he was finishing his final appearance for the company on his own terms. Instead, the match ended in a way he had never agreed to. The bell rang, the decision was made, and in a single moment that the wrestling world would later call the Montreal Screwjob, trust between Vince McMahon and Bret Hart collapsed forever. For Bret, it was a betrayal broadcast to the entire world. For Vince, it was a decision he believed necessary to protect the company he had built. From that night forward, their relationship was no longer a professional disagreement. It became something colder, something personal, a scar that would follow both men for decades. And yet, as bitter as that rivalry became, Bret Hart was not the man Vince McMahon despised the most, because the next name on the list belonged to someone who did not just challenge Vince McMahon inside a ring. He tried to defeat him in a war. Number 4. Eric Bischoff. Unlike Bret Hart, Eric Bischoff was never one of Vince McMahon's wrestlers. He was something far more dangerous, a rival promoter with the power of a major television network behind him. In the early 1990s, few people inside the wrestling world took Bischoff seriously. He had not grown up inside the traditional territory system the way Vince McMahon had. He was not part of the old promoter families that had controlled wrestling for decades. To many veterans of the industry, Eric Bischoff looked like an outsider who had somehow landed a powerful job. But Bischoff had something no promoter in wrestling history had ever possessed: the backing of media billionaire Ted Turner. Through Turner Broadcasting, Bischoff controlled World Championship Wrestling and a national television platform that could compete directly with Vince McMahon's company. What began as a simple rivalry between promotions quickly escalated into something much larger. It became a weekly battle for ratings, attention, and survival. The conflict exploded in 1995 when WCW launched Monday Nitro to compete directly against the World Wrestling Federation's Monday Night Raw. For the first time, Vince McMahon was not simply expanding his empire, he was defending it. Bischoff understood the psychology of wrestling fans, and he used it with ruthless precision. He began signing away some of Vince McMahon's most recognizable stars. Contracts were offered that the WWF could not easily match. Familiar faces began appearing on WCW television, sometimes just weeks after leaving Vince's company. The message was clear: this was no longer competition. It was war. At one point, WCW dominated the ratings for 83 consecutive weeks. Inside the wrestling business, that streak felt almost unthinkable. Vince McMahon, the man who had spent more than a decade conquering the industry, suddenly looked vulnerable. His company was losing momentum. Critics openly wondered if the empire he built in the 1980s might collapse before the decade ended. For Vince, the conflict with Eric Bischoff was not merely professional, it was existential. Every television rating felt like a public scorecard of whether his life's work would survive. Eventually, the tide turned. Vince rebuilt his company around new stars and a more aggressive creative direction, and the World Wrestling Federation reclaimed its position at the top of the industry. WCW would eventually disappear entirely, but the scars of the Monday Night Wars never fully faded. Eric Bischoff had come closer than anyone to destroying Vince McMahon's empire, and yet even he was not the man Vince McMahon hated the most. Because the next name on the list belonged to someone who once helped build that empire before walking away from it. Number 3. Hulk Hogan. For much of the 1980s, Hulk Hogan was not simply Vince McMahon's biggest star. He was the face of the entire wrestling boom that changed the industry forever. When Vince McMahon pushed the World Wrestling Federation onto national television, Hogan was the hero at the center of that explosion. The red and yellow colors, the thunderous entrances, the image of a larger-than-life champion telling fans to train, say their prayers, and believe in themselves. Together, Vince and Hogan created the era that fans would later call Hulkamania. In those early years, the partnership looked unstoppable. Hogan headlined the first WrestleMania and carried the company through sold-out arenas across the United States. Television networks wanted him. Toy companies wanted him. Sponsors wanted him. For Vince McMahon, Hogan was more than a champion. He was the symbol of a new national wrestling empire that had broken free from the old territorial system. But wrestling loyalty has always been fragile. By the early 1990s, the industry was changing again. Hogan's run at the top had lasted longer than almost any champion before him, and both the audience and the company were evolving. Creative tensions began to appear. Contracts became more complicated, and eventually Hogan stepped away from the company that had made him the most famous wrestler in America. For Vince McMahon, that departure was already difficult. But what happened next made it far worse. In 1994, Hogan appeared in World Championship Wrestling, the very promotion Vince McMahon was battling for control of the industry. Suddenly, the man who had once carried the WWF banner was standing inside the rival ring. Fans who had grown up watching Hulkamania on Vince's television programs were now seeing him perform under another company's logo. Then came the moment that turned the rivalry into something unforgettable. In 1996, Hogan shocked the wrestling world by transforming himself into Hollywood Hogan and leading the New World Order faction. Instead of the smiling hero who had defined the 80s, he became the face of WCW's rebellion against Vince McMahon's company. The image was powerful and unsettling at the same time. The man who once symbolized the WWF was now the centerpiece of the promotion, trying to destroy it. For Vince McMahon, the shift felt like betrayal layered on top of competition. Hogan was not just another wrestler who had switched companies. He was the figure who had helped build the entire empire in the first place. And yet even that sense of betrayal did not place Hulk Hogan at the very top of Vince McMahon's list of grudges. Because the next name belonged to a man who fought Vince McMahon every week in front of millions of viewers, and sometimes even inside the ring itself. Number 2. Stone Cold Steve Austin. If Hulk Hogan represented the heroic spectacle of the 1980s, Steve Austin embodied the raw rebellion of the next generation. When Austin exploded into popularity during the late 1990s, he became something wrestling had never truly seen before. He was not a smiling superhero. He was a defiant anti-hero who walked to the ring with a glare, a beer in his hand, and absolutely no interest in following anyone's rules. Ironically, that attitude helped save Vince McMahon's company during one of the most dangerous periods in its history. As the Monday Night Wars raged against WCW, the World Wrestling Federation reinvented itself around a more aggressive and unpredictable style of storytelling. Austin became the centerpiece of that transformation. His feud with Vince McMahon on television created some of the most famous moments in wrestling history. Week after week, the rebellious wrestler humiliating the tyrannical boss became must-watch television for millions of fans. Inside the storyline, Vince McMahon was the villain, and Austin was the man fighting against authority. The conflict felt real because it tapped into something deeper than wrestling tradition. Fans believed it. They saw the anger, the defiance, the chaos. But behind the scenes, the relationship between the two men was far more complicated. Steve Austin was fiercely independent. He believed strongly in protecting his character and the authenticity of what he did in the ring. Vince McMahon, on the other hand, controlled an empire where every decision ultimately passed through his hands. For several years, their partnership worked because both men understood how valuable the other was. Then came the moment when that fragile balance collapsed. In 2002, Austin refused to participate in a storyline he believed damaged his character. Instead of compromising, he simply walked out of the company. The sudden departure stunned the wrestling world. The biggest star of the era had vanished overnight, leaving Vince McMahon furious and scrambling to stabilize his company. For a man who valued loyalty and control above almost everything, Austin's decision felt like a personal challenge to his authority. The two men would eventually reconcile years later, but the incident left a mark that neither of them completely forgot. Even so, Steve Austin was not the man Vince McMahon hated the most, because the final name on this list was never a wrestler at all. He was the man who funded the war that nearly destroyed Vince McMahon's empire. Number 1. Ted Turner. Unlike everyone else on this list, Ted Turner never stepped inside a wrestling ring. He never cut a promo, never held a championship, never stood under arena lights with thousands of fans chanting his name. But for Vince McMahon, he was the most dangerous enemy the wrestling business had ever produced. Because Ted Turner did not need to wrestle Vince McMahon, he had the power to erase him. Turner was one of the most influential media figures in America during the late 20th century. Through his broadcasting empire, he controlled networks that reached millions of homes across the country. When his company acquired World Championship Wrestling, professional wrestling suddenly had something it had never possessed before: unlimited television exposure backed by enormous financial resources. For Vince McMahon, this changed everything. Throughout the 1980s, Vince had conquered the wrestling world by expanding beyond the old territorial system. Regional promoters collapsed one by one as the World Wrestling Federation grew into a national powerhouse. But Ted Turner represented a completely different kind of rival. He was not a small promoter defending a local territory. He was a media titan who could place wrestling on national television whenever he wanted. The conflict became official in 1995 when WCW launched Monday Nitro to compete directly with Vince McMahon's Monday Night Raw. What followed was not simply competition. It became a weekly television war watched by millions of fans across America. For 83 consecutive weeks, WCW defeated Vince McMahon's company in the ratings. Inside the wrestling industry, that streak felt like a slow-moving disaster. Critics openly wondered if Vince McMahon had finally met the rival he could not overcome. The empire that had dominated professional wrestling for more than a decade suddenly looked fragile. Sponsors were watching, television executives were watching, and Vince McMahon himself was forced to confront the possibility that his life's work could collapse. Ted Turner rarely spoke about the conflict with the same intensity Vince did, but the message was unmistakable. Turner wanted WCW to defeat the World Wrestling Federation, and for several years it looked like that goal might actually happen. Eventually, the tide shifted. Vince McMahon rebuilt his company with new stars, new ideas, and a far more aggressive style of programming. WCW's momentum began to collapse under creative chaos and internal conflict. In 2001, Vince McMahon purchased WCW and ended the war that had defined the entire decade. But victories do not erase memories. Ted Turner had come closer than anyone to destroying Vince McMahon's empire. Closer than any wrestler, any promoter, or any rival who had ever challenged him. And in the quiet moments when Vince McMahon looked back on the wars that shaped his career, there was always one truth that remained impossible to ignore. In professional wrestling, enemies are inevitable, but only a few of them ever come close to ending the story entirely. In the end, the story of Vince McMahon is not simply the story of a promoter who built a wrestling company. It is the story of a man who survived one of the most ruthless entertainment industries in America. Professional wrestling has always been fueled by conflict. Fans see it in the ring every week, where heroes and villains collide under the arena lights. But the real battles that shaped the industry often happened far away from the cameras. They happened in boardrooms, television negotiations, contract disputes, and personal betrayals that could change the future of an entire company overnight. Across decades, Vince McMahon faced rivals who challenged his authority, his vision, and sometimes the very existence of the empire he created. Some were wrestlers who felt betrayed, some were stars who walked away, others were powerful executives who tried to destroy his company from the outside. Each rivalry left a scar. But those conflicts also revealed the truth about Vince McMahon. He never built his empire by avoiding enemies. He built it by confronting them. Every challenge forced him to adapt, fight harder, and protect the company he believed would dominate professional wrestling. And in the brutal world of wrestling history, that may be the reason his empire survived when so many others disappeared. Because in Vince McMahon's world, success was never measured by how many friends you made. It was measured by how many enemies you outlasted.